Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us at this session. Apologies, we're running a few minutes late, but I promise that won't go into your well-deserved lunch break in an hour, just under an hour. My name's Katherine McAlpine. I'm a senior producer at Imperial War Museum, and I am privileged to be here chairing this panel on museum ethics in the Me Too era. I'm going to give a really quick introduction just to kind of start off by saying that in a week where our own Prime Minister has been accused of harassment, the Me Too movement feels like it's rarely out of the news. So what are the implications for museums and their staff, and how could and should we be responding to these issues? We were challenged at the end of our keynote this morning to dismantle the patriarchy. And if that's feeling like a little bit of a daunting task for some of us, I'm really pleased to be here with three incredible speakers who, if they're not necessarily dismantling, they're certainly loosening the screws at this point. So just to give you a quick idea of how this is going to run, I'd really like to keep this as informal a session as you can be when you've got lights shining in your face and a Britney mic on. But we're not going to clap in between each speaker. The speakers are going to introduce themselves. They're going to give a sort of 5 to 7 minute provocation and explaining some of the work that they've been doing kind of in this area. And then I really want to open up the discussion to the floor. I'm going to say it now, and I'm going to repeat myself again. Please wait for the microphone if you're going to answer a question. I know it feels a bit awkward sometimes to be waiting, but that's much better to wait a few moments, just so everyone can hear the question and everyone can contribute and be part of the discussion. That's literally it for me, so I'm going to hand over.
Thanks very much, Katherine. Can everyone hear me? Is this happening? Yeah, great. So absolutely delighted to be here and feeling suitably galvanised after that incredible keynote call to action. I'm Adele Patrick, and I am a manager and one of the co-founders of Glasgow Women's Library. I think you can all check out the Women's Library, and we've only got a limited time, so I just wanted to share a little bit of the thinking that I've been doing over the last wee while, acknowledging the impact of feminist thinking on the approaches to addressing inequalities in museums and in wider cultural organisations. I thought I would share a short, I'm glad that's not my phone, I just have that sort of nightmare of that happening, a short extract from an unpublished provocation paper that I produced recently as part of a Clare Leadership Fellowship that I've just concluded, that sets a little bit of the context for some of the provocations I want to share with you today. So as far as my thinking is concerned, the cultural sector is in protracted throes of change, 30 years on from the start of the digital revolution, 3 generations on from the germination of sort of equalities campaigns in Britain, with seismic political and financial churn nationally and globally. The sector, and I'm thinking here about museums, film industry, book, art, music, biennials, festivals, commercial galleries, theatres, to the nationals, have been forced into a period of often reactive introspection, debate and action, confronting challenges along the fault lines of representation, reinvention and relevance. Taking the temperature of the museum sector, R.R. James, one of the growing number of theorists advocating activism, museum activism, as Sharon was doing this morning, is sort of almost like the activism in response to institutional stuckness and the sort of febrile nature of contemporary culture, wrote recently, The here and now for museums is paradoxical, replete with opportunity and constraints, freedoms and danger, clarity and chaos, contradictions born of external issues that push, pull and batter. The paradoxes are in turn accompanied by a host of internal museum issues that hinder organisational courage, foresight and empathy. And I suppose I want to pick up on that idea of what are the blockers here in terms of tackling the claims to, or the idea of institutional stuckness on inequalities. So from my perspective, the sector seems relatively rudderless, the establishment hopelessly out of kilter, with little demonstrable evidence of the seismic rather than incremental impact needed to engage with easy-to-ignore communities. The mainstream cultural institutions appear polarised, set against a rapidly proliferating swathe of equalities-focused, independent resources, online platforms and networks, including, of course, the maverick museums, archives, libraries and cultural lobby groups, some of which were cited earlier on this morning. So the #MeToo and #NotSurprised movements are part of this sort of burgeoning countercultural activist response to these institutional inequalities. And I think I can just sort of flag up a little sort of indication here of the sort of scope and depth that is being illustrated in these unfettered countercultural contexts. So there are consequent and linked proliferation of social media pylons that spotlight the deficit in awareness and embeddedness of inequalities culture within individual institutions and the sector more widely. There's also sort of lots of ethical issues that we need to be thinking about around inequality and the consequent abuses of power that are reaching, as you mentioned there, Katherine, incendiary levels in government broadcasting and, as I say, this sort of wider cultural sector. So having co-founded an equalities-focused museum in 1991, I've been reflecting over this past year, especially around the fellowship, on how to productively explore, claim and foreground a notion of feminist leadership, and wondering how this might help accelerate the processes of change that we all are committing to. So the fellowship has involved visits and discussions with colleagues in Europe, the US, Brazil. I'm going to Kenya later this month. So looking at the embeddedness or otherwise of equalities of gender in museums, and specifically looking at this idea of feminist leadership. So one of the first provocations I suppose I have is, could feminist agency help address the stuck inequalities in museums? But first of all, what are the characteristics or qualities of this within the museum space? So it feels to me that the mainstream, as it were, non-equalities focused museums are relatively comfortable with the development of BAME, LGBTQI+, and women's and leadership initiatives within the bigger institutions, but less so with embracing explicitly feminist leadership approaches. So naming feminism as an operational or strategic approach for addressing institutional inequalities, it just doesn't seem in evidence. So it feels that there's a widespread timidity, or is that resistance, to acknowledging the abuses of power that result from the partial addressing of inequalities, the abuses that the Me Too and Not Surprised movements make visible in these sort of explicit ways. So in making inequality and abuses of power visible, these movements are part of, it has to be said, the continuum of feminist activism. As the Museums Association Museums Change Lives report highlighted, equality and social justice are not the specialisms of most museums, however much the public might expect and increasingly demand of us. However, feminism and feminists in museums have been calling out inequalities and abuses of power in institutions like the ones that we work in for over 4 decades. Feminists and feminist museums, archives and libraries, of which there are still a tiny number, the ones that name themselves explicitly as that, are specialised in this work. So the lack of progress, incremental at best, of museums to address inequalities actually gave rise to countercultural initiatives like GWL, like the Women's Library, like Museum of Homelessness, and so on and so forth. So today's context unequivocally requires change, and my belief is that feminist approaches offer ways to undertake this work in holistic and sustainable ways. If we're not comfortable with feminist leadership, what does it say about our approaches to combating the types of abuse that Me Too and Not Surprised highlight? I'm starting to argue in my research and work in the Women's Library that feminist leadership, like the best work in successful cultural and non-profit orgs, has three characteristics: shared vision, values and mission rooted in equalities, everyone in the organisation clear on their roles and responsibilities in relation to that, and ongoing opportunities for dialogistic, regular discussions and reflection, honest reflection on all of the above. So feminist approaches are evident, although not named explicitly as that, in the MA Code of Ethics. The work of the MA and many museum colleagues and some notable institutions, obviously, are illustrative of the case for embracing inclusive and fair practices in our work. But I want to ask, how do we ensure that there is full alignment, pan-organisational and pan-sectoral alignment across on equality, diversity and inclusion? There's a need for the recognition too, across organisations, of the consequences when we have a deficit of awareness or harbour inequality and inclusion. So I think that the MA Code of Ethics is trying to address this, but I want to ask, as is implied in the second column here, is ethical reflection extending across the ways that we relate to people externally and critically internally actually an essential part of everyday museum practice? Is this what we experience? So the idea of ethical reflection has been underscored in the work that has been developed by Rachel Thane-Gray at Glasgow's Women's Library as part of our Equality in Progress work. So I'll come back to this slide in a second. I know that I've only got a minute to go. But in this work, we're trying to reflect on privilege and the enmeshed experience of discrimination, including our own approaches to working with the collection. So you could check out our Decoding Inequality project as an example of that. Our aim for ourselves and others, when we're working with them collaboratively in our Equality in Progress work, aligns with the MA Code in that we believe that museums should proactively champion ethical behaviour. All staff, in the code it says, all staff, volunteers and governing bodies should be introduced to the code in order to integrate its principle into their daily work. But I'm asking really, to what extent is there a cross-museum ownership of this shared code of ethics on addressing abuses of power? So in our work, we frequently use this adapted roadmap for organisations to check in where they are in terms of equalities. And typically colleagues see things differently. And I think this productively raises issues around this lack of alignment and this notion of shared commitment, awareness and understanding. Finally, before I list just 3 questions for everyone to think about, I'm also noticing the ubiquity of the term everyone both in the Code of Ethics, so everyone has the opportunity for meaningful participation in the work of the museum, and everyone being part of our aspirations that we have for our institutions. These are bold, possibly over-ambitious claims, and in these claims it feels that there's a focus on the external, the public engagement, rather than the internal, and addressing strategic and systemic hierarchical and other structures. So I'm really happy to talk today because I'm involved in post-fellowship research now on radical organograms for organisations, if anybody is geeky in that respect. But I just want to finish with these three quick questions. What is blocking cross-museum commitment on an aligned, holistic approach to equalities? Why is it still something that is parked with some passionate individuals or siloed areas of work? What's blocking ethical reflection as an essential part of everyday museum practice? And what would happen if museums used the F word in their progressing of equalities and embraced feminist leadership?
Thank you, Adele. That was really interesting. Can you all hear me? So I'm Irene Aristizábal. I'm the head of Curatorial and Public Practice at the Baltic in Gateshead. And I've been working there for the past 6 months. Before that, I was head of exhibitions at Nottingham Contemporary. And where? Sorry. There. So I'm going to speak a little bit about an exhibition that one of the last exhibitions I curated in Nottingham, titled Still I Rise, Feminism's Gender Resistance. But I will also speak about the work we're doing at the Baltic under the leadership of Sarah Monroe, the director. So with Still I Rise, it's an exhibition that I initiated about 3 years ago, and we were very keen to work on an exhibition that would look at the idea of resistance, but looking at how feminism and gender theory have influenced the way artists, architects, designers, activists embody resistance or have looked at the idea of resistance. And for us, it was very important that the exhibition reflected, the methodologies reflected the ideas within it. And I think that's a really key question in our everyday work as curators or museum practitioners. This question of the ethics of the ideas that you're looking at and how those are embodied in your methodologies or in your processes. So it wasn't easy. It was thinking about feminism, we're thinking about collaboration, collapsing of hierarchical structures. We're thinking about care, how to care for each other as colleagues, how to care for the artists that we work with, caring for our audiences as well, but other species, other beings that we relate to in our world. And this idea of collaboration was at the core of the exhibition. So we started working with Rosie Cooper, the head of exhibitions at the Delaware Pavilion, and with Cedric Fogg, who is now a curator at Nottingham Contemporary. When we started working together, he was an assistant curator, and it was very important that the three of us had the same input in the project, even though there were different hierarchical positions within the organizations that we worked with. But also collaboration with our colleagues within the institution. As Adele mentioned, there is and as you all know, there is a tradition of silo working within museums and art galleries, where curatorial departments initiate ideas for exhibitions, then those are communicated to the other teams, the learning team or the education team, then responds to that idea and delivers activities. For the ideal way we wanted to work with was that the learning team, the public program team, and the curatorial team would work together, not only at Nottingham Contemporary, but at the Delaware Pavilion as well, from the inception of the project. That was a really beautiful idea. That wasn't very natural to implement, because at least at Nottingham Contemporary, it's not the way we had been working. And I wasn't the director of the organization, so I couldn't just say, okay, this is how we're going to work with, just let's all embrace this together, and everyone would listen to me. It was an invitation to our colleagues to work in that way. There was some resistance, but through the process, which dealt with the issues of the exhibition, but also larger issues that the organization had to work through, we worked together in collapsing the hierarchy between the public program and the exhibition. And we worked in a way where the public program was part of the exhibition and was present in the galleries. We had a film program that ran every week that was sitting within the gallery. We had performances, workshops, talks that were present in the gallery rather than being in a separate space, in the performance space further away from the exhibition. And in the process, it was also a question of collaboration between two institutions at the beginning. At the moment, the exhibition went to Bristol, to Arnolfini, so it's the third act of the exhibition is presented there at the moment. But it was also very important that for us as curators, that we worked with the idea of intersectionality as a methodology, rather than as a distant idea that that was looked at only through the work of the artists. Thinking about how artists were looking or were affected by intersectionality within their work, within the questions that they dealt with in the work. And something that we made visible through the gallery guide for the exhibition was how we were looking at key ideas that connected the artists and the works. And you can have here an image where these key ideas that were important in the making of the exhibition sort of gave a thread between the different artists. It's not an exhaustive list of terms. We edited down that so that it was legible for our audiences. But also thinking about intersectionality in the way we were constantly questioning. I guess it's in relation as well with methodologies of consciousness raising and constantly questioning the different positions that we were located within for the exhibition as curators, as practitioners, as institutions. And for us, it was very important as well. Of course, at the core of the exhibition and of the project, the conversation with the artists and with other arts organizations that we worked with. We worked very closely with several feminist archives. In the iteration at the Arnolfini now, we've worked in close collaboration with 3 curators and artists that have curated selections of different feminist archives. But I don't have much time, so I'm just going to very briefly mention the work we're doing at the Baltic. So under Sarah Monroe's vision, we're working towards becoming a feminist institution, taking a more experimental and creative approach to how we work, embedded in the structure of the institution, working very closely between the different program teams, so the learning team and the curatorial team. We are generating the program together. But we're also forging models to challenge traditional hierarchies within the institution, also with how we work with close collaborators, but also with communities that are close to us or audiences that come from further afield. And our work is really grounded, again, in this idea of care, importantly listening to the different constituents that we work with the artists. There is a lot of work that we still need to do. This is a work in progress, and I think that's really important to be mindful of, that there is not a moment where we reach a point where things are delivered and that's it. We need to be constantly working. We need to be constantly be mindful of our position and our privilege within the world. And as an important arts organization in the country and locally, we are really working mindfully, thinking about what our civic role is, and thinking about how civic space can foster new thinking, knowledge, and having a transformative role in society. So hopefully we will be, that will be visible in the work we do to our audiences and to our colleagues elsewhere. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Clare Gannaway from Manchester Art Gallery. Can everyone hear me okay? That made perfect sense, and hopefully I can follow on from that by talking about kind of specific example of something that happened at Manchester Art Gallery. There are some Manchester colleagues in the room who, for some of them, this will be very familiar. But in planning what I was going to do with my 5 minutes, I thought that it might actually just make sense to tell the story a little bit, because not everyone is necessarily aware of Nymph Gate, as it has become known, or hashtag Nymph Gate. So in early 2018, we were in the middle of working with Sonia Boyce, the amazing, brilliant person and artist, on her solo exhibition. And part of that was to work on something new with Sonia. So that commission was really inspired by what Sonia likes to do with her practice, which is look at what happens when people get together. Am I flicking through these, or are they going to roll? I'm not quite sure. Yeah, they're going to roll. They're going to roll. So it might not sync exactly with what I'm saying, but hopefully illustrate some of the things I'm talking about. So I asked Sonia if she'd be interested in just starting off with some conversation, particularly looking, just walking through some of the galleries that hadn't changed for a long time. Well, actually, since 2002, when the gallery reopened after a period of development. So we started like that. We started walking, talking through those spaces, and a series of conversations which grew and started to include more and more of the staff team, led to really a focus on a specific gallery space, which at that time was called In Pursuit of Beauty. So the process involved sitting in the gallery and discussing how we thought and felt about that gallery space, the whole context, the title, the combination of artworks in that room, and the ways in which they were interpreted. Sonia constantly prodded us to talk as people who happened to work in this institution, so not to think about how visitors or users or constituents, or however we want to describe people who come into the gallery, not necessarily to think of what we would do for those people, but actually what did we think? What did we think as people who worked in that institution of this gallery? Sonia was very keen to use a kind of takeover format and to film that and to make that into an artwork. So we invited drag artists from Family Gorgeous, who are all based in Manchester, just had their own Channel 4 show, as I'm sure many of you have seen, and artist Lizana Shabazz, the queer performance artist, to come and respond to that gallery space and the theme of In Pursuit of Beauty and what that meant to them. We didn't know what any of them were going to do before that evening. But the thing that got the really big reaction was a group decision by the gallery staff who were involved in this process of conversation to temporarily remove Hylas and the Nymphs by J.W. Waterhouse and temporarily replace it with a text which mentioned some of the things that we'd been discussing throughout this process, with a view really to opening that up more widely and more publicly. Then it all kicked off. So just to explain what happened, because this sometimes does get lost, an individual who was quite relatively close to the process actually became very uncomfortable with this temporary removal, although he had been involved in some of the conversations and was involved in that takeover activity. Let's go on to the end now. Just go back. I'm not sure if it's possible to pause these. So then, yeah, he went to The Guardian, and Jonathan Jones wrote a very sensationalist article without speaking to anybody from the gallery or actually finding out anything about what had happened. This kicked off a bit of a shitstorm. Social media, I think 4 articles in The Guardian in total. And yeah, for a while it was a bit all-consuming and quite crazy. But that reaction, and this is what's important, this only means something if it's part of a process of learning. So all of that reaction was actually incredibly interesting to unpick. And revealed a huge amount about what people think about art galleries, about art, about artists, curators. It also reveals the extent to which the media and social media polarize what are actually quite nuanced and complex topics. All these conversations that we were having, trying to make more public, became very, very polarized and very simplified, not helped by supposedly professional journalists writing a load of nonsense. It also revealed, so I should say actually what became the story was that a curator, i.e. me, had stood in a gallery and decided to take a painting down because I didn't like it, which was not quite the case. It was part of a process of making an artwork, part of a group decision-making process, which was actually about making positive change and encouraging more thinking around this particular display, but also the role of art galleries, what we're there for. It revealed a lot about the nature of conversation as well within institutions, and we've been thinking a lot about who was involved in those discussions and conversations and how we can really take forward that kind of positive way of including more people in discussion about the gallery and the decisions that we make. And who's involved in decision making. We talked about how the kind of traditional power relationships impact on people's behaviour in galleries, and some of the things even that we witnessed while we were sitting as a group speaking in the gallery were interesting to observe, to say the least. And some of the stories that started to come out about members of the staff team's experience of interactions that they'd had throughout the gallery spaces, which again were very interesting. We talked a lot about how institutions have been perpetuating myths by contextualizing groups of artworks in very particular ways, how paintings that were made for private houses to be enjoyed or used in specific ways are now displayed as collection highlights, and how the way in which art and collections are used is something that we need to be thinking about really carefully. But it was also very revealing that many people in their reaction were really relying on the idea of art for art's sake. That, this idea of don't make this political. These are paintings that we love and they don't have a political meaning. So don't do that, naughty curator. And in the context of the Me Too discussion, I was asked directly by journalists about the impact of Me Too on the project. But also, lots of people were saying in their reactions that Me Too should never have been associated with an art gallery, that it was just not relevant. This is art. When you're sitting in a gallery called In Pursuit of Beauty, and you're surrounded by paintings of naked women, I think it's kind of relevant. But again, a lot of that context got lost in the reaction. Having said that, the reactions were so varied and so mixed, and often it's the loudest, most negative or confrontational voices that come through the strongest. Actually, some of the Twitter reactions are very mixed. But it's definitely impacted on the way that we work. And none of it would mean anything, as I say, if it wasn't part of a process. The whole point of starting the conversation in those gallery spaces was to think, okay, there's the potential for change here, and how could we do things differently? So we've really tried to emulate a lot of the conversation that we were having with Sonia, and we've been running a program called Whose Power on Display. We've done some public events associated with this, but actually there's been a really strong focus on internal conversation with the staff team, acknowledging, as we did last year, that we're all human beings who work within an institution. And I suppose, running on from what you guys have both said, thinking about what our kind of shared ethics are as a team. But also how we're going to have to shift our kind of programming to really look at Whose Power almost as our whole program, and thinking about how we don't just focus on blockbuster temporary exhibitions and temporary projects, but how we shift our resources and acknowledge the bits of the building and the collection that have not changed for a long time, that we can actually do far more with. It's a really exciting opportunity. So we've just been looking at layering some interpretation, because obviously change is very, very slow. So one of the things that we can do is just put in some temporary signage just to acknowledge some of the conversations that are going on. And we are thinking about the whole kind of suite of galleries in terms of maybe shifting the narrative from the grand tour into one that's much more about migration in the 21st century, shifting from romanticism and nature to exploring the climate emergency, looking at an introductory gallery which looks at where the institution and the collection actually came from, and telling some of our more difficult sometimes stories, and working particularly with the visitor team on that. So opening up and not closing down the stories that we tell. How our work in future with Suzanne Lacey and the collection highlight by Ford Madox Brown work could actually shape a gallery which is all around the theme of work. And how we can continue to sort of queer any conversations that we have about gender in relation to the galleries and the displays. So we can embrace the nuance and the messiness a bit more than has been the case in the past. I'm probably running out of time rapidly, but just an example of a recent project which was very inspired by some of this, Get Together and Get Things Done, which actually actively sought to crowdsource interpretation, and actually this idea that the world outside could never affect an art gallery, that this is art for art's sake. We do need to continually challenge that. So this crowdsourced interpretation was about actually encouraging people to write on cards and leave them in the exhibition space. And those cards actually became, they got just as much attention as the artworks on the wall. And amongst themes like climate and Brexit and debates on trans, actually it was really interesting that the theme of kindness came through really strongly in those cards. A lot of people wanted to express how we should be kinder to one another, which is, I think, very interesting, and we'll be evaluating that, I'm sure. Yeah, I have run out of time. I think that's about all I can say at the moment, but I'm hoping that we can have a bit of conversation around some of these ideas as well. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for that. I'm going to open up for questions in a minute. I would usually kind of use my chair's privilege and start off with the kind of first question myself, but I think in the interest of time, I'd really like to open up. So does anyone have any questions? I'm going to kind of select someone, wait for the mic, then I'm going to do a bit of a summary, and then we'll go to the question. There's one just here. Fantastic. Hold that thought for just a second, and I'm going to just do a little bit of summing up. Because the question I was going to ask all three of you was around the relationship between the kind of the personal and the institutional. But actually, through the conversation, the discussions, provocations that you've all just given, I think actually my question probably would have missed the point. I think it's not about the individual. One of the things that's really come through is about that collaborative process. It's about that working in a group. And I think that really harks back to some of the things we were hearing about the keynote in the introductory session this morning around finding your network, finding those people who have those values that that you share, and kind of, because being a change maker is a lonely business, and I think that's really important. So my kind of task to all of you is, if you don't have your network, please use the next 2 days to go and find it. And I'd like to sort of open up now, having made my kind of pledge and done the summary, to our very first question.
Thanks. I'm Clara Payla from the Liverpool Museums. I mean, thanks for those very interesting contributions. I think they focused quite a lot on museum content and their external outputs. But I can't help to come back to the idea of museums as employers as well, and how they deal with sexual harassment internally. There should be no tolerance for sexual harassment in museum staff, whether it's by visitors or colleagues. But I think still far too often, it's about the burden of proof is, on the survivor. The account of the survivor and the perpetrator are often put on equal footings, leading to very little actions. And I was wondering if speakers have got views on that aspect, and how ethics in the Me Too era must extend to staffing and dealing with sexual harassment, supporting colleagues who speak out.
Thank you. Do you want to start?
Yeah, just one thing that I suppose it's a question to your question, because when I was looking at the Code of Ethics, which I have to admit really didn't know very much about at all before I was invited to do this session, and so it really didn't have very much bearing on what happened at Manchester Art Gallery. In going through it, I did notice that there doesn't seem to be a mention of staff. It's all about collections, and how we should treat the public, but doesn't seem to be very much in there about the ethics of how people could behave.
I think that there is definitely something in the Code of Ethics. I think my feeling is that the two sort of areas that are the internal and external, and aligning those is sort of partly what I was trying to express earlier on. But this sort of, I feel like there's still a residual sense that buying into and meaningfully engaging with equality is somehow like optional, or that there isn't legislation around the issues around, for example, protected characteristics, or certainly abuse in the workplace and so on and so forth. And I do feel like there's a huge question out there about how we all subscribe to a code of ethics. I mean, I think that the MA's code of ethics is a really great place to start, and for each institution to develop. I think that's part of what the code is about, so to say, build on, adapt. We certainly had a call at the keynote to sort of say we're open to hearing how this could be evolving, and just picking up on the points earlier on that this is a sort of evolving discussion, and there's no scope for any organisation to be complacent. But I still sort of feel like there is that idea that some people are choosing to park their values at the door when they go into work, and understand that as another place, and that aligning between the personal and professional values, I think, is something that organisations are not doing an enormous amount of work on. But I don't know, is there something that you want to say about this?
I think the question of the ethics being reflected within the workforce is essential, and that applies to sexual abuse or harassment, bullying, but also racism, xenophobia. It is really important that the ethics of the organization are embedded at all levels, from cleaning staff to the board of trustees. It's all the different layers will, if the organization really embodies and lives the code of ethics, the program, the way it receives its visitors will be in synergy, and the parameters for protecting staff or protecting visitors, protecting artists will be able to be followed and not just sit on a piece of paper. So I think it's a work that goes through an administrative thinking, but also it's further than that. It's in the everyday. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Are there any other questions that I can see? There's someone just here.
Hello, thanks very much. I think this is probably more aimed at Clare. Did you feel supported by your senior management leadership team, or did you feel sort of chucked under the bus? Yeah, and I was kind of hoping for more concrete examples today, because I've been thinking, my organisation is tackling the gender pay gap and has managed to make it worse. And I was wondering, are there good practice examples, or does it feel like it's a woman's problem to solve, and we're struggling against the tide? It's actually making it worse somehow. Sorry, that was not just aimed at Claire. That was for everyone. It's just
to answer your first question, I did feel supported because I was part of a team of people who came together and worked with Sonia together. So I think in that sense, it goes back to what's been said already, that kind of finding your network. So yeah, there was a lot of support. It all happened incredibly suddenly. So, it was so the top, yeah. We didn't have a director at the time. And yeah, we talked about it a huge amount, and we just got through that situation together, and that the abusiveness goes away very quickly, and then it's about what you do with it, isn't it? And so I think that's the important thing, that we are coming together as a staff team to talk about what we have learned from it and take it forward. So, yeah. It is a supportive environment, yeah.
In terms of your question of pay gap, I think something that hasn't happened within the arts is to have a transparent questioning and evaluation of paying structures within museums and arts organizations. There has been anonymous lists that have been posted on Google, mostly from the US, a little bit within this context as well. But that is a really important question where transparency is at its core, and for many different reasons, arts organizations or the people at leading or boards of trustees are nervous about that question of transparency, about even small organizations having a clear pay structure that is visible for all staff. That should be the norm, and there is no reason why a small organization might not be able to do it because the resources are smaller than a larger organization. And I think all workers should demand that and should work towards getting that forward. And when I say all workers, I think it's very important that within our society, within our museums and arts organizations, we are conscious that the people at the top don't need to make the change for us. We can make that change, and voicing our opinions and our positions is as important as going to vote and as waiting for change to happen, because change won't happen if we as individuals don't make it happen. And that demanding transparency, demanding structures that are clear, it falls within us as well.
If it's helpful in any respect, I mean, obviously I'm coming from a position of having helped to found an organisation in the light of seeing little change or lack of representation in the mainstream. But over the last few years, I did mention that we've been developing this equality in progress work, working with mainstream and bigger institutions to try and address the absolutely multifaceted area. I mean, you're asking almost like we came in with this daunting prospect of having to dismantle patriarchy and capitalism in an hour or whatever. And of course, this is a sort of like hugely complex terrain. But certainly looking at the Equality in Progress material on our website, that it has been designed as a sort of like, I hesitate to use the words, but toolkit for people who are working within institutions to use to sort of think about the intersecting inequalities that are evident in terms of our audiences, but also need to be addressed within the sort of largely still homogenous, groupings that there are within the sector in terms of the people who are representing museums. So, it is a big ask, but I do think that we have to be working on every single register. I think we need to be working in terms of the collections, the interpretation, the recruitment, the way that we work with volunteers, pay structures, addressing abuse, microaggression. There are very many things that we need to be addressing all at the same time. So yeah, it's a big ask.
It certainly is, and it's definitely not something that we're able to do in an hour, unfortunately. In order for me to keep my promise that I wouldn't keep you from lunch, that's going to have to be the end of it for the questions. As someone I think said at the beginning of today, we will leave this conference with more questions than answers, but hopefully with a sense of hope. I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to plug a couple of other sessions if you've been kind of spurred on by some of the conversations we've had today. I'm sure some of you wanted to speak a bit more about kind of intersectionality and how to queer the museum. I've got to give a plug for Queer Avengers this afternoon. It's 3:10. If you're interested in that conversation around kind of harassment and workplace practices, there is a session tomorrow on Sticks and Stones about bullying in the workplace. That's at 11 o'clock. And then Fair Museum Jobs doing great work, and they're sharing their work tomorrow at 3:30. And if you're interested in looking at ethics, we've got Ethics 101 at 11:30 as well tomorrow. So all it remains for me to do is to thank you all for your thoughts and your contributions and your questions, and to thank our amazing panelists. Thank you all.